Hello, I'm Aoife Clifford and I'm an author. My book, Second Sight, which is published by Simon & Schuster, is the story of Eliza Carmody. And we start with Eliza is driving through her hometown of Kinsale, where she no longer lives, and she's not happy that she's there. She's there for work. She's a lawyer. She's working on a very important case. It's a class action that's to do with a bushfire that had devastated the town a couple of years before. But according to the town, she's on the wrong side. She's working for the electricity company that they're blaming, and she's a little bit ashamed by that and a little bit defiant about that. She also doesn't want to be there because she has issues with her own family. So while she's happily or unhappily driving through the main street of the town, she witnesses an act of road rage, violence that ends up with a person who's killed. And so, unbeknownst to her, she's going to be dragged back into the town and into her past, and it all goes from there. This is my second book. My first book was All These Perfect Strangers, which came out a couple of years before this one, which was set on a university campus and also a country town. I myself am from a country town, so I'm very fond of them. And that was about Pen Shepherd, who gets involved in a whole bunch of murders at her hometown. She's a classic unreliable narrator, and how much she has got to do with the murders, how responsible she might be or not responsible. Is she the victim? Is she something totally different? Is explored in the book. They get classified as crime fiction, but I wouldn't describe them as the heart of crime fiction. Perhaps the first one, and there was a debate at the time when I was putting them out for offer in publishing houses, and there were several offers for young adult because of the age of the protagonist. And then with my second one, it is a literary crime fiction. So while crime fiction's at the heart of it, there are other kind of issues that explore about memory, about the past, about how we deal with grief, how we deal with a traumatic event. I'm quite interested in taking issues that are being discussed in society and exploring them. And one of the issues, which unfortunately has become relevant every time I talk about this book, even though this book has been out for a couple of years, is one of the issues that is explored is historic rape. And of course, Katie, I'm talking to you when Australia is going through the same discussion again, but when it was released in America, it was released just at the time of the Kavanaugh hearings for the Supreme Court. And once again, we saw the consequences of actions taken by people and experienced by people in their teenage years coming back to haunt them or to be explored, and the effect of them, years and years later. And that's actually one of the things at the heart of the book, obviously totally unintended, but has been part of the social discourse ever since. I genuinely love writing. I started writing about 15 years ago when I was at home with very small children, and I could feel part of my brain kind of shriveling the part that you had a spell or construct a sentence. And it was a New Year's resolution. And I thought, I'm going to set myself the task of writing a short story. It was something I'd always wanted to do, but had never really had the time before. And so I thought, I'm going to give it a go. And they always say, write about what you know. So I knew it was always going to be a murder, a crime fiction story, and I was going to enter it into the Scarlet Stiletto. So that gave me a good deadline, which is always a great thing to have. So they said, write about what you know, so I set my murder in a kindergarten. Now, no one had ever done that before, and it was a very sort of comic. I loved writing it from the start. I thought it would be really hard. In fact, I found it a very enjoyable experience, and I ended up winning the Scarlet Stiletto. So that's all the encouragement I needed to then be here 15 years later, having written quite a few short stories now and a few novels. Oh, look, I did write as a child, but not really stories. Like, I remember I went through probably a very bad poetry stage. But my first genuine thing would be that story. I hadn't written seriously for years and years. Oh, that's probably not true, actually. There was a children's book I had written once again, just around this time as well, which I did enjoy writing. That was all. It was the catchy title was Sugar-Free George and the Great Chocolate Secret, which they immediately told me was too long a title, but I liked it. Well, it was interesting. 2020 obviously was a challenge for everybody, and by comparison, my 2020 was a lot better than a lot of other people, so for that, truly thankful. But I did have a house full of people. I had 3 kids homeschooling. So even though I'm quite used to being at home and writing, I wasn't used to not having a space to do that, as everybody else took all the spaces up to try and Zoom and a classroom or work or whatever it was. So it did take me a little while to get going, but on the whole, writing was once again a total gift to be able to get away from the everyday, to be in a world which I controlled, which was lovely. So I wrote my 3rd novel, essentially, during 2020, and that kept me sane. Well, interestingly enough, the very last event that I was supposed to do was to be at this wonderful bookshop, and we had, it was about 12 months ago, we had the discussion, would we do it, would we not? It was at the very start of it, we weren't sure. I woke up with a sniffle, immediately started panicking. You guys all thought about all your wonderful customers and readers that you didn't want to expose to anything awful, and we decided to cancel. So sadly, that happened. It was very disappointing at the time, but we're here now, and it feels like it's a little step back to normality, which is lovely. No, I'm not a full-time writer. I'm a bookseller a couple of days a week at Fairfield Books, which is a indie bookshop just, not so far away from here in Melbourne. I do other writing-related sort of activity. I have a regular book group that I run at a local school. Last year I was very lucky to also have as a distraction during lockdown was I judged large short story competition. So I got to read 572 short story entries, and that was actually at the time, and when they said a lot of people wrote, and so they had way more entries than they were expecting, and so everyone was a bit taken aback when we saw that was how many entries. But actually it was such a lovely thing to do because it was a genuine connection into a whole bunch of other people's heads, how they were feeling right now, what were their concerns, and it was able to kind of take a snapshot of the world. And this is an Australia-wide competition, so it wasn't just Melbourne, even though there was a lot of Melburnians. You could tell from where they had said it or some of the things they were discussing. But it also covered a range of ages. So there was, I'm guessing from the content, quite a few older men writing short stories. And it was really interesting to see what people were thinking about, what people held on to, and things like there was quite a few World War II short stories, which was fascinating to see. That was still such a cultural reference point for a lot of people. There was bullying at school, which we kind of think is a modern issue or a modern concern that we talk about now. I'm telling you, that was always a concern. From these short stories, that was being explored in different generations. And so that was a fascinating thing to me. And it was that wonderful bridge that writing and reading is that it's a personal connection between reader and writer. And in some of the cases, I might be the only reader of that story. So it was a lovely thing to experience. I really enjoyed it. The problem is 2020 was a wonderful, wonderful year for books. So I have so many favourites, but probably I'll take one from the start, which was Animals in That Country, which just has won very deservedly the Victorian Premier Prize for such an extraordinary book. It was one of the extraordinary books of that year. There were many very good books of that year, but that's and the interesting thing about it, for those people who might not have picked it up, is it is about a pandemic, but the genius of it is that is actually one of the least interesting things about the book. That book is such an extraordinary book with so much to say about our relationship with animals, that the fact that it was written in a pandemic, written about a pandemic and then published in a pandemic, merely coincidental, is the least of it. It is a really extraordinary book. I tend not to read it, crime fiction, while I'm writing it. It's just a bit too close, and I'm sort of aware that perhaps ideas may bleed from their page onto mine. But what I tend to do is, when I'm not writing, holidays or whatever, That's the genre that I'll catch up on. Being a bookseller though, I will tend to dabble into it if there's something big just to get a feel for it, or just I need a break and want to have some fun, I will do it. But probably, for the most part, I'll keep it at bay while I'm writing. It's a very, very good question. And it probably isn't an author, but I was very taken with Rapunzel as a child. I don't know what about Rapunzel particularly spoke to me. I mean, it's a pretty gothic kind of fairy tale, and I had the fairy tale where it was all there on the page. You know, the prince at the end has his eyes poked out by thorns and all the rest of it. It wasn't a sanitised version. It definitely wasn't Disneyed. But for whatever reason, that was the fairy tale I forced my parents to read me every night, and they wonder why I'm a crime author now, quite frankly. But yes, that was it. So I'll have a book coming out next year, probably about this time actually. Once again, probably one that is a bit hard to define. I call it literary crime fiction. Other people might call it something a bit different. It has a lot of art in it, and having written it during 2020, it has a lot of interesting kind of environments in it. It explores art, and I think it was a vehicle for me to see something beyond my own four walls, and so I loved exploring that in fiction. Thanks so much for having me today.